Hello, classmates. This presentation will be a little bit different from my usual presentations, and that it's a bit more extemporaneous. My current research has taken a hard left turn, which in this case is actually really good because it moves towards the direction that I've been wanting to head anyway. If you've ever heard the term experimental archaeology, you'll find this is usually when an archaeologist digs up evidence and usually you see it in boats, but in other things as well. In one case, particularly with one of the dissertations that I looked at, it was with siege engines and siege warfare. The researcher, Amy Schofield, from University of Manchester in 2014 wrote their dissertation, Experimental Archaeology and Siege Warfare, Analyzing Ancient Sources Through Experimentation. What they essentially did was they took literature from ancient sources, Athenaeus, Josephus, Thucydides, Plato, Plutarch, Aristotle, Vitruvius, and they put together a plan of several siege engines. And their methodology was basically to analyze the ancient literature, take the materials that provided enough information to actually go through the process of describing one of these siege engines, to build it, and then to test it out. So, of course, the first part was to do the analysis of the literature and then to actually build, in this case, catapults. And they followed that up with experimentation. That experimentation was on materials used for the missiles, projectiles, how these siege engines operated, and did those operations match how they were described by the ancient sources. And then to also look at the broader use, locations, how they were set up, what their ranges were, what the portability was, and how these results would compare to the way they were described in ancient texts. And interestingly enough, they concluded that the historical accounts were fairly accurate across the board for all of these siege engines. And really, when you think about it, there's no other way to collect the data. If they not actually built them, there's no way they could determine whether or not those ancient sources were providing them with valid information. I've often thought of the possibility of taking an experimental approach to history. For me, that would be in the case of technologies from my period of interest, which is the Industrial Revolution, and in particular communications. So what are those communications technologies, and how can I apply building them, experimenting with them to see how they function in a real world environment and how beneficial that might be. And this also, of course, applies context to the research. So it allows me as a researcher and as a historian to say, okay, I can apply certain context that I have, having built one of these things, having used it and applied it in a real world situation, which is, I find, very useful. Or at least that's my interpretation of it. Another dissertation I looked at was experimental archaeology and ethnography, its perceived value and impact in archaeology and research. Experimental history doesn't exist as of yet, but experimental archaeology does. And so I'm looking for the comparatives in the methodology. In this particular dissertation, they were directly speaking to the replication of artifacts and processes, but looking at how archaeologists felt about experimental archaeology and how they felt it impacted the field. And so I'm looking into a more or less historiographic approach at how experimental history might be conducted, and then apply that in a historical research project and apply those methodologies to that to see where that goes. So I'm looking forward to your comments, and I hope to hear from you soon. And I will be looking at your videos. Thank you very much. Have a great day.